The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. The air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat.
You're listening to Truth Talk.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere.
With Paul Webster and Chance George.
The first year of global governance with the establishment of the G20 in the middle of the financial crisis.
President Bush signed a formal agreement that will end the United States as we know it.
Nope, no weapons over there.
People who have been yelling, oh, the UN's going to take over global
conspiracy
government.
Theorists.
They've been crazy, but now they're right.
Yeah.
Maybe under here.
But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that.
With us, we have Jim Fetzer. This is episode 75, Connections of JFK, Watergate, Iran-Contra, and the 9/11. Sorry about a little bit of trouble with the intro, but now that we have that up and running, welcome to the show today. I'm so glad and honored to be able to have you on.
Well, Chance, it's a real pleasure for me to be here with you today. The title, actually, you alluded to is the theme. It's of an article by Peter Dale Scott, who is among the most brilliant students of JFK, who introduced the idea of deep politics in his first book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, which supports a view about the assassination that enables us to disentangle the various elements and the players from one another by having three layers or levels of analysis, one being the sponsors, who included the CIA, the Joint Chiefs, the anti-Castro Cubans, the Eastern establishment surrounding the Fed, the Mafia, the Texas oilmen, and Israel. And it's important to understand the motives each of them had, but just to present the overview initially, and then we can explore this in greater detail. Between them and the mechanics, the actual shooters, in Dealey Plaza, where I have done my best to identify six, where I believe there may well have been at least one more, but also their supervisors and coordinators, where the shooters appear to have included a Dallas deputy sheriff, an Air Force expert, a Dallas police officer, a mob and CIA guy, Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman, and an anti-Castro Cuban. And I can explain how we know from the medical evidence and ballistics where the shots they fired were located, including altogether 8, 9, or 10 shots, because there were at least 3 misses. But I'll explain all of that. Where Edward Lansdale, an Air Force general celebrated for organizing assassinations all over the world, especially in Vietnam, appears to have been the one who situated each of the shooters and determined the sequence in which the shots would be taken. But also, interestingly, George Herbert Walker Bush, who already had long ties with the agency and who appears to have been inside the Dowtax building, from which 3 shots were fired, the only shots fired with an unsilenced weapon, in order to create the acoustical impression of there having been only 3 shots, especially given the way the buildings were located. The acoustics were quite unusual, and I can also go into that in some detail as well, where he was supervising the hit team involving the shooter who would take those 3 shots with a Mannlicher Carcano, by the way, because of which it's such an unreliable weapon. He had 2 misses with 1 hit. After the driver, William Greer, had pulled the limousine to the left and to a halt to make sure JFK would be killed, that shooter, by my identification, but with assistance of others in a better position to know than I, was Nestor Tony Escadro, to whom a statue was made down in Freedom Park in Little Havana. So if you go down there, they have one statue to Jose Marti, who actually liberated Cuba from Spanish domination. But then you have this other statue, very curious, because virtually no one has ever heard of him. But if you were asked someone in the vicinity who was knowledgeable about these things, he'd explain that statue was there because he took care of business.
Unbelievable amount of information that has come out with the JFK, and with it being 50 years now, it's undeniable. They say that there's polls of 80+% people. I believe that it's much higher than that. The people that don't believe something different from the official story, they are either completely asleep or even lying to themselves. I myself, at a much younger age, I didn't actually get exposed to it until the Oliver Stone movie came out, which subsequently lent me to read Jim Mars's Crossfire, and that was just an excellent read and lots of information. And it seems like every year that there's more and more and more stuff came out. I managed to do my first show on it during the 49th anniversary, and I went into some of Jack White's photography and what happened with the Zapruder film, and just the amount of work that went into this. I can't believe it. Now, just to see if I did my homework right, you mentioned that there was 6 shooters. Maybe I have the names right. This was Harry Weatherford, Jack Lawrence, Nestor. I won't even try and pronounce it.
Tony Escadro.
Yes. Roscoe White, Malcolm Wallace, and Frank Sturgis. Is that the list that you have there?
Yeah, that's very good. Those are the shooters that I identify, where Harry Weatherford was a Dallas deputy sheriff. He was firing from the top of the county records building. He was using a .30-06 to fire a Mannlicher Carcano bullet, apparently to implant it into the body, using a plastic collar known as a sabot, S-A-B-O-T, which was later found on the roof of the building. It has an interesting history. Jim Mars and I have discussed it. When he fired the shot, the first to hit JFK in the back, about 5.5 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column. It was a shallow shot that only went in about as far as the second knuckle on your little finger. And according to a story I have learned from his former neighbor, because the man himself is now deceased, the driver of the Secret Service limousine, which was, of course, immediately behind JFK's Lincoln, when they arrived at Parkland, got a bucket and sponge and began washing blood and brains out of the limousine, completely improper. But also during the process, he found what appeared to be a whole slug of a bullet, which he took inside the building and left on a stretcher, which may therefore actually be the origin of the bullet that was claimed to have been the magic bullet, of which, of course, there was no such thing, because we have the shirt and the jacket he was wearing. We have the autopsy diagram. We have an FBI sketch. We have the president's personal physician's death certificate. We have reenactment photographs done by the Warren Commission staff. And we have the mortician's descriptions of the wounds, all of which chance locate that wound where I have placed it 5.5 inches below the collar to the right of the spinal column, which means, of course, that there was no bullet that hit at the base of the neck and passed through the neck without hitting any bony structures, only to exit his throat and go into the back of John Connally. Indeed, as though most Americans are unaware, the FBI and the Secret Service concluded already the day of the assassination that there had been 3 shots with 3 hits. The Jack had been hit in the back, as I've located, that Connally was hit in the back, and then Jack was hit in the back of the head, killing him. It was only after they discovered that one of those shots fired from the Daltex, in fact, had missed, hit a curb, and injured a distant bystander by the name of James Tague, who'd actually been injured by either a chunk of concrete or a fleck of metal, that they had to subtract 1 and account for all the wounds on the basis of only 2 shots, which required a certain degree of ingenuity. Believe it or not, it was Gerald Ford, who was then a junior member of the Warren Commission, who had the description of the wound redescribed from his uppermost back, which was already an exaggeration, to the base of the back of the neck to make the trajectory more plausible. It's fascinating, and was already observed by Mark Lane in his completely brilliant book, Rush to Judgment, published already in 1965, that when the physicians who'd actually observed these wounds, including Malcolm Perry, MD, who'd actually performed a simple tracheostomy incision through the wound to the neck, and had described it 3 different times as a wound of entry in response to reporters' questions, explaining the bullet was coming at him and that it was an entrance wound, in order to not allow the physicians to explain what they had actually observed and what they had inferred based upon their observations, where Dallas at the time was the homicide capital of the universe. And these physicians at Parkland were very experienced dealing with gunshot victims, so they knew what they were talking about. Instead, Arlen Specter, as Mark Lane brilliantly observed, asked them a hypothetical question. He said, if we assume that the bullet entered at the base of the back of the neck, indicating the location, and if we assume that it passed through the neck without hitting any bony structures, and if we assume that it came out here at the front of his throat, would that be consistent with describing the wound at the front of his throat as an exit wound? To which Malcolm Perry, for example, replied that, yes, that is correct if we were to make the assumptions that he'd just been asked to make, but that he was not in the position to vouch for or verify the assumptions that had been made, which, of course, he knew was preposterous. In fact, it's completely ridiculous. Cervical vertebrae intervened. The wound isn't even anatomically possible. And I was looking now and preparing for a presentation for this 51st observance of the assassination, that even the paintings done by the Navy artist at the direction of Commander Humes, who was not, where the artist was not shown any photographs of the body, don't include the neck vertebrae. Where David W. Manick, MD, PhD, he has both a PhD in physics and an MD from Michigan, and he's board certified in radiation oncology, which is a treatment of cancer using X-ray therapy, and is the leading expert on the medical evidence in the world today, took a patient with similar chest and neck dimensions, created a CAT scan chance, and then plotted the official trajectory, only to discover that cervical vertebrae intervene, and therefore it's not even anatomically possible. What I find fascinating about all this, and by the way, I gave a presentation exactly on this subject to an international conference at Cambridge in the UK, subsequently published in an international peer-reviewed journal, which everyone can download from themselves online if they will simply search for the title Reasoning About Assassinations, is that, as you will see there, even the Warren Commission's own staff during the reenactment had a stand-in for JFK who had a small patch at the back of his head, slightly to the left, where the Bethesda physicians claimed he'd been hit in the back of the head, which appears to be true, but they're ignoring the much more significant wound that he suffered to the right temple, which created a massive blowout at the back of his head. And a larger patch lower down for the bullet that hit him in the back, about 5.5 inches below, where another of these photographs shows a young Arlen Specter holding a pointer, illustrating the trajectory that the magic bullet would have had to have taken were it true. And if you look down below his hand several inches, you see that patch on the back of the stand-in, which means that a photograph that was intended to demonstrate the magic bullet theory actually instead refutes it.
Now, it seems to me that there was a lot of assuming going into there, and no one really assumed maybe a more logical thing, like somebody shot through the front of the windshield and hit him in the throat. I saw when I was trying to do some editing and making a little documentation of the Zapruder film for my first time covering it, I seen he was actually, it looked like he was holding his throat coming through there, and you can already see the hole in the windshield. And like,
oh, of course, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Chance. You can see the hole in the windshield in the very famous photograph taken by AP photographer James Ike Alchins. And you can see Jack clutching his throat. That was the second hit. The first was in the back, which I've already described. The second was to the throat. It passed through the windshield. A fellow by the name of Doug Weldon, J.D., who an attorney from Kalamazoo, Michigan, did extensive research on that particular shot. There were lots of confirmations of the bullet hole, including multiple witnesses at Parkland Hospital. One, a police officer who actually took a pencil and stuck it through the hole to confirm for himself that it was a through-and-through wound. where Doug Weldon even tracked down the official at Ford Motor Company, where the limousine was sent already on Monday the 25th to be completely torn down to bare metal and rebuilt, including replacing the windshield, where he recorded interviews with him, which he was reluctant to have released during his lifetime, and which Doug respected, but where you can trace back the origin of that shot to the south end of the triple underpass, where it appears to have been fired by the Air Force expert, you mentioned his name, Jack Lawrence, who had only gone to work for the automobile dealership that provided the vehicles for the motorcade a few days before. After the shooting, he would return there all muddy, nauseated, and vomiting. Muddy because he appears to have made his escape through the fairly elaborate sewer system beneath Dealey Plaza. And it has since, so far as I am aware, simply disappeared, quite possibly from the face of the earth. I would mention, incidentally, that the Secret Service would later display a windshield that had a few cracks from a fragment fired from behind, as though that were the windshield that had been on the limousine at the time. But precisely as you remark, if you look at JFK in this very famous photograph, if you look where his left ear would be, if his left ear were visible, you'd see a small white spiral nebula with a dark hole in the center, indicative of that through and through shot through the windshield, and where it also turns out to be visible in frame 226 of the Zapruder film at the time it hit the windshield and passed through to strike JFK. Bob Livingston, a world authority on the human brain, who is also an expert on wound ballistics, explained to me that he believed that, in fact, that bullet had hit bone and had fragmented, part going down into JFK's right lung, the other upward into his brain to rupture a very tough membrane called the tentorium that covers the cerebellum, which is a compact part of the brain at the base, where he drew that inference on the basis of the multiple consistent reports from physicians at Parkland Hospital that this very substantial blowout at the back of his head, and it was the size of your fist when you double it up. So if you take your right hand and double it up, and I recently injured my rotator cuff, so I can't do it for you, but if you place it at the back of your head, about where you would recline if you were in a bathtub, that's the location. And it was the dimensions of the wound where they reported seeing cerebral as well as cerebellar tissue extruding. Bob had explained to me that even if JFK had been shot twice in the head, once from behind and the other from in front, entering the right temple, in fact, a frangible or exploding bullet that set up shockwaves that blew his brains out the back of his skull, which was already weakened to the left rear, so that when they impacted with motorcycle patrolman Bobby Hargis, he initially thought he himself had been shot, that even the near simultaneous occurrence of those two shots would not have been sufficient to rupture the tentorium, which therefore had to have a different alternative explanation, which appears to have been from the fragment of the bullet that hit JFK in the throat. I should add at this point in time that it has fascinated me to learn, and this is rather recent, that David Mantic now believes that JFK may have been hit yet a third time in the head. But I have only received a sketch about this from David and haven't yet been able to figure out either the medical effects or the ballistics of this shot as to where it may have been fired from. But we have JFK hit those 4 different times: in the back, that shot fired from the top of the county records building; in the throat from the south end of the triple underpass; in the right temple by the shot fired from the north end of the triple underpass that appears to have been fired by Frank Sturgis. And you'll love this story, Chance, that a New York City Gold Shield detective by the name of Jim Rothstein arrested Sturgis when he came to New York City in an effort to silence Marita Lorenz, who'd been deeply involved in a lot of the planning in New Orleans. She'd been a mistress of Fidel Castro. The CIA had tried to recruit her to kill Fidel. and she was going to testify to the House Select Committee on Assassinations when it reinvestigated the case in 1976-77. Well, they got wind of it, and Rothstein arrested him entering Marina's apartment, intent upon killing her, and put his .38 to his head, took him into custody, and they had a conversation, which Rothstein initiated, I think, quite deliberately by saying, "good shooting." And that Sturgis started talking about it and said that he'd shot JFK because he was having affairs with women who were spies for foreign nations and jeopardizing national security, and because he had betrayed the brigade at the Bay of Pigs, and that he'd been aiming for his eye, but JFK had moved slightly, so he wound up hitting him in the temple. That's about as good as you're ever going to get from one of the actual assassins of the President of the United States. And I happen to know Jim Rothstein personally and sought his permission for me to identify his role in acquiring this information, which I've just provided to you here and now.
So Frank Sturgis is one of the people we see being arrested at Watergate as well.
I don't recall that Sturgis was at Watergate, but there were connections there. Nixon was paranoid about his role in the assassination becoming public, and used the burglars to invade the Democratic headquarters there for the sake of determining whether they had any information about Dallas. He used the code name Bay of Pigs when he'd have conversation with Haldeman and Ehrlichman, which Haldeman had inferred was his covert way of talking about the assassination of JFK, which he did not want to come out. So we have the deputy sheriff on the top of the county records building hitting JFK in the back. We have the Air Force expert firing a shot passing through the windshield, hitting JFK in the throat. And then we have Nestor Tony Escadro firing from the Dow Tex, where what appears to have been the third of his three shots actually hits JFK in the back of the head. He slumps forward. Jackie eases him back up, and she's looking him right in the face when he's hit in the right temple by that frangible or exploding bullet I've already described, which was fired by Frank Sturgis. But where other shots were fired, you mentioned Roscoe White. He was actually in a police uniform. He was a Dallas police officer with ties to the CIA. He had what might have been considered to be the easiest shot from the grassy knoll.
He's our grassy knoll guy, right?
He's known as Badge Man. You mentioned Jack White. Jack White identified this figure, Badge Man, in the very famous Polaroid photograph taken by Mary Mormon. At the time, he was collaborating with a fellow by the name of Gary Mack, who would go over to the dark side and become the curator for the Sixth Floor Museum, where he has done everything he can to stifle or suppress or suffocate information about the assassination, including, for example,
gatekeeper.
During an interview with Mary Mormon, talking about what she did that day. They were on the grass opposite the grassy knoll, because Mary had explained previously, just as Jean Hill, her friend who was standing with her, that they had both stepped into the street. Mary would take these Polaroid photographs, but Jean would have to apply a preservative coating. And she stepped into the street to call over to JFK, "Hey, Mr. President, look over here. We want to take your picture." And right about that point, Mary had stepped into the street, took this famous photograph, which occurred just a fraction of an instance after the Sturgis bullet, it would appear. Though I got to say now, the time frame, because of the alteration of the Zapruder film, which I will explain, momentarily, makes it difficult to say these things with greater precision. But here you had Gary Mack preparing her for an interview that was going to be filmed. And each time she started to step off the grass, Gary told her, no, don't do that. So that she repeatedly tried, but finally she didn't. And he said, "We'll use that take." And as Lifton observes, he doesn't know quite what to call this, but what it clearly was not was history.
Now, speaking when you say history, I keep seeing flashes of Vincent Bugliosi's giant book, Reclaiming History, where he says he takes on every conspiracy theory out there, which I kind of think is more like critical thinking than conspiracy theory. Like I saw a debate with Cyril Wick and him, and it seemed just like maybe Cyril was just kind of getting caught up in his speech a little, and Vincent came across really good, but I just the nonsense that he has coming out compared to the information that you and your co-researchers, just what do you say? Just one more quick comment on the JFK, and we'll try and move along. I'd love to talk about my JFK and my generation, the 9/11 event. Just one more quick comment. What would you say on the subject of, to these people like Vincent Bugliosi who believe they've debunked everything, or what I would say to someone like my father who says, you've got to be out of your mind, how could none of this could be possible, we would all know by now?
Well, I know Vince Bugliosi. We had dinner together, he and I and Jesse Ventura, when Vince flew out to Minneapolis, St. Paul to receive an honorary law degree from a law school there. But, if you want a much better exchange involving Vince, go to Jesse Ventura's wonderful 1 hour, actually 48-minute program on JFK. He flew me out to California to set up the simulation of the shooting. We had a far superior Mannlicher Carcano. Jesse Ventura is a far superior shot. We arranged bales of hay where I made sure they were at the right locations and angles for Jesse, who was on a lift, to attempt the shooting. So these were stationary targets with a better weapon and a better shooter. And although he tried 3 replications of 3 shots each, and then subsequently, after it was over, just took a whole lot of time to see what he could do, he scored exactly 1 hit out of all those shots, and none of them were in the allotted time. If you actually view it, you'll see me with a stopwatch counting off the amount of time here, and I think the quickest was like 8 seconds and 11 hundredths. I mean, it was ridiculous. The longest he did 14.
I guess to be accurate, you would have had to have Jesse have 5 other guys set up around there, all shooting at the same time, and that might have helped out his target there. Now, well,
this was just, of course, to see whether Oswald could have even performed the feat.
Oh,
now,
yeah, of course.
Vince look, the best sniper in the Marine Corps, Gunny Carlos Hathcock, attempted to replicate the shooting at Quantico. Now, this guy is the best shot in the Marine Corps. And he tried repeatedly and couldn't do it, and reasonably concluded that if he couldn't do it, how could a guy who was a mediocre shot like Oswald, who barely qualified, for example, in 1959, have possibly done it? And the answer is he couldn't. And frankly, Chance, we may want to stay today on JFK because it's so terribly important, and because the 51st anniversary is around the corner. Vince Bugliosi really is faking his way through this, and I'm sorry to say that Cyril Wecht was not a good person to put up against him. Let me give you an illustration of why. David Lifton, in his completely brilliant book, Best Evidence, observed the distinction between the fist-sized wound at Parkland and the enormous wound described in the official autopsy report from Bethesda Naval Hospital that represents the entire back of his head, well up to the top, as missing. It turns out that we now know, because of work by the Assassination Records Review Board, which was a 5-person civilian panel created by Congress in the wake of the resurgence of interest generated in the case by Oliver Stone's film JFK, that Douglas Horn, who was a senior analyst for military records, has explained how they discovered when they were deposing the mortician, Thomas Evan Robinson, who had spent the most time with the body and preparing it for the formal state funeral, which ultimately was done closed casket, I think for the reason that JFK from the front looked just fine. Jackie, in fact, said that when she gave her testimony to the Warren Commission, that from the front he looked just fine, but that she had a terrible time holding his skull and brains together at the back of his head. Well, if he looked just fine, that means he wasn't hit in the back of the head, because a high-powered bullet from the back of the head would most probably have come out the front of his head. And in fact, if you look at the extant version of the Zapruder film, which they had to revise because the limousine stop was such a clear indication of Secret Service complicity, you'll see it kind of bulging out to the right front in the vicinity of his right temple. You also see a blood spray that hangs in the air ever so briefly, where Noel Twyman, when he was preparing his masterful bloody treason, nearly 900 pages about the individuals and groups who were involved in the assassination, brought in a Hollywood consultant, an expert in special effects by the name of Roderick Ryan, who would receive the Academy Award for his contributions to cinematography in the year 2000, where Ryan explained to Noel that bulge that seemed to be a brains out the right front had been painted in, as had the blood spray. And in fact, John P. Costello, another PhD, this time from Australia, with a specialization in electromagnetism, the property of light and of images of moving objects, who has become the world's leading expert on the Zapruder film, determined the blood spray dissipates too fast to be a bona fide phenomenon. Each of those frames is occurring officially at 1/18th of a second. And you see the blood spray, and then you don't see the blood spray, but it should have been, much more substantial. In fact, one of Abraham Zapruder's closest friends, whom I cite in the third of my 3 books on the assassination of the great Zapruder film hoax, explained that there was a much more massive blowout, when he was hit, and that there was much more debris that traveled back and to the left. I mean, it was very substantial. And you don't see any of that in the extant film. He just happened to have the chance to view it before it got into the hands of Time Live, and before the Secret Service, turned one of their copies over to the CIA so they could revise it. Where in fact the original was taken back to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C. already on Saturday. It was 8mm already split film that had been developed in Dallas, and one film crew worked on it there. They had to have a shop owner open his store so they could buy an 8mm projector because they didn't have one on hand in their facility. But the other was brought down the next day. It was a 16mm unsplit film that had been developed in Rochester, where the CIA has a secret photo lab called Hawkeye Works, adjacent to Kodak headquarters. Now, I mentioned the split versus unsplit. The way the Zapruder camera worked is it takes a 16mm strip of film and films down one side called side A. Then you have to take it out, flip it over, and film the second side, B. So if you wanted to run it all continuously, you'd have to split the film and then splice together A with B in order to run it continuously. In fact, we have with Zapruder, less than a complete side A, so we never actually had to take it out and flip it over. But I'm explaining, that there were at least 5 different physical properties that distinguish the original film brought on Saturday from the substitute brought on Sunday. And we now know that they did a great deal to alter it. We have a half a dozen others who have seen what appears to be an unedited version of the film. They have all confirmed that you can actually see the turn from Houston onto Elm, where Greer swerved out too widely and nearly hit a concrete abutment. Then had to get back online and abruptly pulled the limousine to the left into a halt after bullets began to be fired. And that there were, at least the 2 shots I've described, where he was hit in the back of the head and slumped forward. And Jackie eased him back up and was looking him right in the face when he was hit in the right temple. And then, Chance, he slumped over to the left. Not the violent back and to the left motion you see in the extant film. That appears to have resulted from the way in which it was edited. They took out too many frames.
So they're editing.
The idea, Chance, was to conflate both hits.
Their editing actually caught themselves in it then.
Well, they did. You see, as John Costello has explained, the film is like 98% technically perfect, but the other 2% has enabled us, together with eyewitness reports and studies of the medical evidence and other photographs and films and so forth, to put together what in fact happened and what it should show if it were authentic. And, quite a few things have happened since. In fact, new research by a fellow named Larry Rivera, who is a completely brilliant guy, discovered that a fellow named Fred Newcomb, who was an early student of JFK, had done interviews with the 4 motorcycle patrolmen who were escorting the vehicle. In fact, one of the 15 signs of Secret Service complicity in setting him up is that the motorcycle escort was instructed not to ride forward of the rear wheels, which meant basically they weren't providing any protection whatsoever for JFK. But where Officer Jackson, riding on the right, reported how Officer Hargis, who'd been impacted with all that debris, actually got off his motorcycle and ran in between the 2 limousines to get to the other side of Elm Street. So when you take into account all the things that were happening after the limousine stopped, that he was hit in the back of the head, that he slumped forward, that Jackie eased him back up, that she was looking him right in the face when he was hit by that second shot, it blew a big chunk of his brains out to the trunk, which is why Jackie gets up and starts to go for it. She's not trying to get away from a shooter in the car. She's going after a big chunk of JFK's skull and brains, which she holds in her hand all the way to Parkland. And after they have pried JFK's moribund body from her arms, she composes herself and walks into trauma room 1, where he was being treated, turns to the anesthesiologist, Pepper Jenkins, extends her hand and asks, will this help this big chunk of his skull and brains? I mean, it's the most poignant moment in the history of the assassination. She knew a lot about literature, culture, the arts, music, the classics and all that, but she was completely oblivious of biology, neurology, brain surgery, wound ballistics and the like. It's very, very touching. But the Warren Commission excluded her testimony from its published report on the grounds of privacy, ostensibly, but in fact it's because she said that he looked just fine from the front, which would have been inconsistent with their claim that all the shots had been fired from above and behind. And of course, as you perfectly properly observe, the wound to the throat and the wound to the right temple were both fired from in front. In fact, the former medical examiner for New York City, Michael Batten, who would chair the medical panel for the House Select Committee, has observed that if the magic bullet theory were false, then there have to have been at least 6 shots from 3 different directions. And in fact, we know there were at least 6 shots because, you see, once you recognize that there was no magic bullet, that it wasn't even anatomically possible, you have to account for the wound to the throat and the wounds to Connolly on the basis of other shots and other shooters, where the wounds to Connolly appeared to have been fired from the book depository, the side opposite the 6th floor window, from which no shots appeared to have been fired, by Malcolm Mack Wallace, who was Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman, who murdered a dozen people for Lyndon, including one of his own sisters. So that he was firing, I believe, in the mistaken belief that it was going to be Texas Senator Ralph Yarborough in the limousine. LBJ had a huge fight with JFK that morning where Lyndon was trying to get his close friend and political ally John Connolly out of the limousine and Ralph Yarborough, whom he despised, in. But JFK overrode him on the ground that the chief executive of the state should ride with the chief executive of the United States. But there wasn't time to get the word to the assassins, the shooters, that it was going to be Yarborough instead of, Connolly instead of Yarborough, which actually chance benefited them politically because since Connolly was such a close friend of Johnson, no one would be inclined to think that he would have something to do with a shooting in which John Connolly would be seriously injured. And then we have at least 3 shots that missed. In fact, Connolly was hit anywhere from 1 to 3 times because a shot to his back was 1. He actually explained when that happened. He turned to the right to see what was going on behind him, and then not being able to see, turned back to the left, and that's when he felt this doubling up in his chest. But then he had wounds that may have been from separate bullets in his right wrist and in his left thigh. Plus, there were 3 shots that missed. There was one that, the one I've already described, that missed and injured the distant bystander. Another that missed and hit the chrome strip over the limousine. That was the third of the 3 shots fired from the Dow Tex. And then one that was found in the grass opposite the grassy knoll, which I believe was the shot fired by Roscoe White, where I believe he pulled his shot, it was deliberately missed because he would have hit Jackie. It's very clear that they were under strict instructions that Jackie should not be harmed. and they had to go out of their way to make sure that that did not happen. In identifying the sponsors and the mechanics, I left out the intermediate group, which are the crucial players, namely the facilitators, where Lyndon Johnson himself was the facilitator of the assassination, and J. Edgar Hoover, his close personal friend, the facilitator of the cover-up, which was left to the FBI, which never even, just to show you how blatant it was, Chase, never even questioned the 10 closest witnesses to the limousine, including the 4 motorcycle patrolmen who have confirmed that the limousine was brought to a halt. And when you put all that, everything that was taking place, it appears to me that limousine halt had to be on the order of, say, 15 seconds. I mean, just ask yourself, how long would it take to hit Jack in the back? He falls forward. Jackie eases him up. He's hit the right temple. He slumps to the left. She gets out, goes after the chunk. Officer Hargis getting off his bike, running in between the limousines, the opposite side. Clint Hill rushing up to get on the back of the limousine before it takes off. And interestingly, if you compare alternative films here, the Nix film, which was taken from the opposite side of where Zapruder was standing, shows Jackie going further back on the trunk and Clint Hill further forward onto the trunk than we find in the Zapruder. So we have inconsistencies between these different films. And even though they painted over the blowout at the back of the head when they redid the film at Hawkeye Works in Rochester, New York, they overlooked later frames. It occurred to me they were focusing so much on frame 313, which they had merged these two shots together, that they and frames immediately thereafter, that they might have overlooked that it could be seen later on. And indeed, in frame 374, you can actually see the blowout. So you can compare the blowout with the area that David Mandick discovered in the autopsy x-rays that had been patched, and you find there's a very high degree of correspondence. There were so many witnesses who reported JFK had this massive blowout at the back of the head. They had to do something to conceal it, and they not only painted it over in the Zapruder film, and it was done very crudely, where a group of Hollywood experts has an extremely high-quality version obtained from the National Archives, and they have just been appalled by how crudely it was done. So, I mean, we have the best possible experts verifying this to be the case. Well, with what David discovered in the x-rays, I'll never forget the conversation we had in late 1992 when we first began collaborating, that he thought he might find both evidence of a second shot to the head, which indeed he did, but also that the x-rays had been altered, which indeed he also did, all of which I published in my first book, Assassination Science, 1998, along with Bob Livingston, a world authority on the human brain's observation that they had substituted someone else's brain for that of JFK, based upon his observation that the brain seen in diagrams and photographs in the National Archives is a virtually complete brain with a completely intact cerebellum and even very limited damage to its cerebral cortex, which he found, of course, to be completely inconsistent with the Parkland Hospital physician's reports of extruding cerebral and cerebellar tissue. So if you compare the blowout, as David defines it, this area P, he was extremely myopic at the time, which assisted him in doing this test from physics known as optical densitometry that allows you to reconstruct the relative density of the objects whose exposure to X-rays created the image, because the more dense the object, the more X-rays it absorbs and the fewer reach the photographic plate. So that if you develop the photographic plate, areas where you were X-raying a very dense object would be lighter and lighter, even white, which had led David to be suspicious of these X-rays in the first place, because the degree of contrast between the light and dark portions of the X-rays was overwhelmingly greater. I mean, on the order of 500 or more times greater than you'd find in a bona fide, a real X-ray. He has now been back 9 or 10 times. He's been able to establish all of the X-rays in the National Archives are copies. Not a one of them is an original. And some of the proofs are surprisingly straightforward. Like one of the X-rays has a huge gouge in it. You can see the gouge visibly if you look at it visually, but if you put your finger on the X-ray, there's no gouge present, indicating it can't be the original X-ray, which when he explained to his son, who was a teenager, he immediately discerned, indicated that it wasn't an original. Now, what's so important about all this the alteration of the film, the substitution of another brain, the altering of the X-rays chance, is that none of those things could have been done by, say, the mafia or anti-Castro Cubans.
It shows a little bit closer to home and a little bit higher ups, proving that this is a little bit more serious than what we've been led to believe up till this point. Now,
you're exactly right, Chance, and that's why. I mean, you're talking about X-rays that were under control of officers of the United States Navy, the president's personal physician, and agents of the Secret Service.
Yeah, not many people have control to be able to make Secret Service stand down, to change parade routes.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
It's almost too much.
And indeed, we know a tremendous amount about Lyndon. I got to know a longtime mistress of Lyndon by the name of Madeline Duncan Brown. She began an affair with him in 1948, bore him a son, Stephen, in 1950, not his only child out of wedlock, but his only male offspring. Because of her relationship with Lyndon, she was invited to a lot of events, including a gathering, a social gathering at the home of Clint Murchison Sr., one of the powerful oil barons. His son, Clint Murchison Jr., owned the Dallas Cowboys. Before the assassination, it included an unusual assortment of heavy hitters. J. Edgar Hoover was there, for example. She thought perhaps it had been in his honor. He often would stop in Dallas en route to the Del Mar racetrack, where he'd lay down bets and invariably win. It turned out that the Del Mar racetrack was owned by Clint Murchison Sr. So Edgar was there. Richard Nixon was there. He'd been driven out by a local Republican leader who worked in the same bank building where Madeline was a young advertising executive. George Brown and Root Heavy Construction, which would receive a no-bid contract to dredge a new port at Cam Ranh Bay when the Vietnam War went down. I'm quite sure Vietnam, having many magnificent natural ports, did not need another, but they received $1 billion for doing it. Interestingly, John J. McCloy, our former High Commissioner to Germany, was there. He had also served as chief executive officer at Chase Manhattan, and I believe was representing the interests of the Eastern bankers and the Fed. H.L. Hunt was there, nominally the competitor of Clint Murchison among the Texas oilmen, but someone with a profound hatred of the Kennedys, who distributed wanted for treason posters all over Dallas before the motorcade took place. And one of Lyndon showed up late in the evening, unexpected to Madeline at least, and these heavy hitters disappeared into a boardroom. They had a meeting that lasted 15 or 20 minutes. When it was over, Lyndon strode over toward her. She thought to whisper sweet nothings in her ear. Instead, he told her in a hateful tone of voice, he wouldn't have to put up with embarrassment from those Kennedy boys any longer after tomorrow. That's not a threat. That's a promise. 6 weeks later, during a rendezvous at the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, Texas, Madeline confronted him with rumors rampant in Dallas at the time that he's been involved, since no one stood to gain more personally. And Lyndon blew up at her and told her the oil boys and the CIA had decided that Jack had to be taken out. We have a lot of corroboration from Billy Saul Estes, a Texas oilman, who performed a lot of scams on behalf of Lyndon and John Connolly and their cronies, who knew both his chief administrative assistant, Cliff Carter, and Billy Saul and Malcolm Mack Wallace, his personal hitman, and had conversation with them both before and after the assassination, where Billy Saul told William Raymond, a French investigative reporter, that Lyndon had sent Cliff Carter down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. We have similar confirming reports from Barr McClellan in his book Blood, Money, Power, where he worked for this very powerful attorney, Joe Clark, in Texas, who helped to plan the assassination. We have the report of E. Howard Hunt, where he gave a deathbed confession to his son, St. John, that the chain of command went from Lyndon Johnson to Cord Meyer to David Atlee Phillips to William Harvey to David Sanchez Morales, and then below them, the various shooters, the mechanics, and the supervisors I've already mentioned. Sorry to
interrupt.
Go ahead,
that was one of my favorite things that came forward when I believe it was Rolling Stone broke it, and he came out on Coast to Coast AM and talked about all this. I don't know why. Well, I do know why, but it's just it should have been front front-page story in every newspaper in the world, the deathbed confessions of E. Howard Hunt, the proof of conspiracy. He was actually in a lawsuit in the 70s, I believe, where he was told, basically with Time Life suing, and it was proven that
I think it was the Liberty Lobby, but it was Mark Lane wrote about it.
And he lost.
Yeah. That's right. He brought a lawsuit for Mark Lane, writing that the CIA had been responsible for the assassination of JFK. What you want to bear in mind, Chance, is the CIA has massive influence over all of the media in America. One of the first reports about it came from, I'm glad to say, was also published in Rolling Stone by the co-author of the book on Watergate entitled The CIA and Carl Bernstein and the Media, where Bernstein reported that officials of the agency were boasting that their greatest successes have been with Time Life, the New York Times, and CBS. Subsequently, William Colby, former director, observed that the CIA owns everyone of significance in the major media. They most certainly have massive control over the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times, ABC, NBC, CBS. I mean, the litany is virtually unending of the grip they have on the American media, so that other than by way of outlets like this, Chance, the American people have very few opportunities to learn the truth about what happened to our 35th president.
Well, I'm absolutely just honored that you're able to come on a show like this and be able to present the information. We've almost chewed up the entire hour. It just blew by, and I never even got to ask one question about 9/11. If I take a 1-minute break, is there any way we can come back and get a couple of 9/11 questions in?
Well, Chance, what I think, 9/11 is so complex. Let's do a whole nother show on 9/11. Let me just add that if you go to Veterans Today for my articles, which can be found at veteranstoday.com/author/Fetzer/.
I see the new one today.
Yeah, but it's not about JFK. That happens to be about Sandy Hook. But you'll find, a whole host of articles, including these by Larry Rivera, a brilliant piece by Richard Hook. Did George H.W. Bush supervise a JFK hit team? To which the answer is emphatically yes. But also I have 3, presentations I've made visually, which were videotaped and are available online one is entitled "What Happened to JFK and Why It Matters Today," which I presented at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2011. Another is entitled "JFK at 50, The Who, the How, and the Why," from 2012, which has been very popular and gives you a general overview of the entire assassination. And then the most recent was given at Santa Barbara, where I organized a conference there to observe the 50th his death. Jack and Jackie had honeymooned in Santa Barbara. It worked out beautifully. You can find the whole Santa Barbara conference, all 6 speakers online, if you go to JFK 50th, the assassination of America. And you'll find my most recent presentation there. There's a tremendous amount about JFK that we know today. In fact, I'd submit we know 95 to 98% of all that happened. And it's simply a matter that the American people don't know what to believe. And let me just thank you, Chance, for giving me this chance to talk with you about JFK. And I look forward to a return engagement where we can give a similar thorough, in-depth treatment to 9/11.
Well, the 9/11 one, like I said, that is what woke me up, as I am, a lot younger than some of the people that have been doing the research into the JFK. If they lived through it, you had to be about 50 plus 60 to remember it. So the 9/11 is quite on my page, and I just so much information. I wanted to ask you questions about stuff like the Black Eagle Trust Fund, the directed energy weapons, the mini nukes, all the different alternatives out there that we don't actually hear about a lot of people talking about. And then when I was on your site today, I noticed the new Wolfgang article about taking down his GoFundMe account, I believe it was, and there's just so much information about Sandy Hook. Two episodes ago on my show, I did a complete about 50 different bullet points on Sandy Hook, everything from running the capstone event, the FEMA drill, everything from the Halbeg presenting the 11,000 page manuscript. Just so much information on all these things, and I'm just glad that there's people like you out there doing this, and if we can have you back for the 9/11 episode, that would just be tremendous, and trust me, I'll have notes for that one and be prepared on that one as well.
We'll do 9/11, Chance, and then if you like, I'll come back again to do Sandy Hook and the Boston bombing. The American people are entitled to know the truth about their own history.
The Boston bombing, it was probably one of my first times going from a kind of a reporter to a journalist, where I saw on my local stations around here, our mainstream in Canada, that they were doing documents or quick sound bites from the aunt who lives in Toronto, and I live very close to Toronto, so I immediately called her. And I was the only alternative media until she finally made it to like the Alex Jones or that, but the only alternative media to get an interview with her. And she told me about how she saw her nephew on TV. He was the naked man that they put in the car. He was later silenced. She said that they would silence the other brother and not let him to talk, and they cut out his throat, and so much breaking info. And from that moment, my station had been basically, hijacked, lots of fishy things going on, and I love being a part of this now, and I'm just so glad we're going to be able to talk more about that.
You're doing a great job, Chance, and I look forward to a return engagement.
Awesome, thanks a lot, and we do have another show tomorrow night for Truth Talk. Myself will be returning, and then Bev Collins with 9/11 Talks will be rounding out this week's show. Bev did give me your email and was able to get me in contact with you, and she says hello, and she was very glad to have you on her show as well.
Well, my great pleasure, Chance, to you and to Bev.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, and thanks to everyone who tuned in. You've been watching another edition of Truth Talk. Once again, all our archives can be found at webookyourshow.com. I'll say goodbye to you as soon as I play this outro. Thanks a lot again.
You got it. Thanks, Chance.
You're watching Network Radio. Live from the Media Broadcasting Center.